Well, welcome to the Center for Global Justice, Centro para la Justicia Global. We're very happy to have you with us today. We have since COVID started, been doing webinars by Zoom. But now we're able to do hybrid meetings with live audience, as well as some of you who are on Zoom. Because of the fact that we were not doing in-person events for such a long time, we find ourselves very, I need to be enabled the screen share. We have found ourselves unable to raise the funds that we have in the past, and so we ask now for your donations, and you can send your donations through our website at www.globaljusticecenter.org, and we're happy to receive whatever amounts you're able to contribute. Today's speaker is Henry Veltmeyer. He is teaches at University of Zacatecas, and has published many books, as you can see. In fact, there are enough books here to fill an entire bookshelf. He's written extensively on Latin America, frequently co-authoring with James Petrus. And today he's going to be talking about the leftward trend in Latin America and where it is likely to lead. So let me turn the floor over to Henry Veltmeyer.
I'd have to turn it up to shoot my head. Yes. Okay, if you can just get my notes on. Well, thank you, Cliff, and the Center for Global Justice for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you for being willing to sit through it. Both those here in person and perhaps some online. I've titled this talk as The Left Turn in Latin American Politics, with reference to what in the last couple of decades has resulted in the formation of a progressive cycle in Latin American politics. And as you know, there's been many non-progressive cycles, but we are right now in the pendulum of electoral politics. It seems to be swinging back from the right to the left, but not without problems, etc. So I was going to talk a little bit about that, but first a bit of an introduction. In recent years, Latin America has captured the attention of the world in regard to the emergence of very powerful forces of resistance and opposition to the advance of capitalism in the form of neoliberalism, the so-called the neoliberal policy agenda, shall we say, of some governments. That is a belief in these governments or officials in the virtues of free market capitalism of the free market, as well as extractivism. So extractivism refers to a development policy that depends on the extraction of natural resources for exportation in primary commodity form, now without processing. And that has been the dominant model of economic development, well, actually for centuries, but in the last 3 decades, it's taken on a new form. So we now talk of not extractivism, classical extractivism, as in the mining sector in Mexico, but what we refer to as neo-extractivism. What that is, I'll discuss in a moment. But we can say at the outset, extractivism refers to a pillage of the region's natural resource wealth. The extraction of natural resources, such as metals and minerals and oil and gas, etc., and agro-food products, this time for the capitalist market rather than for local consumption. This is based on what we might refer to as extractive capital, which is investment, foreign investments, in this case, foreign investments in both in land, acquisition of land, and extraction of natural resources for export in natural form. This model or approach, form of capitalism, has resulted in enormous windfall profits for the corporations in this sector, many of which are Canadian, which dominates extractive capital or mining capital in Latin America and the world, actually, but also, of course, American corporations. And not only do the corporations make enormous profits, but some of the the value of the exported product is captured by governments in the form of either royalties, charging the corporations for use of the land and extraction of resources which belong to the people in the region, as well as taxes. Now, the value of these taxes and royalties not very great, very small percentage of the total, let's say, the total value of exports. But the governments have this stake; they have an interest in the export of natural resources and foreign investment in this of these resources, because they can then generate some additional fiscal revenues to finance social and development programs, in particular to finance social programs of poverty reduction. In the case of governments that are following now not the neoliberal policies line, but the post-neoliberal approach line, which is basically to use the fiscal resources derived from exports of natural resource wealth to finance poverty reduction programs. That's what I mean by the progressive cycle, referring to governments who change their policy regimes basically to finance poverty reduction in order to create what they call a more inclusive form of development. You might call this neo-developmentalism, as well as the old developmentalism, which of course had a very different outcome. Anyway, these investments and extractive operations that result from them has produced not only profits, additional fiscal revenues, but also enormous social and environmental costs. Costs which are borne by the population, the local population. In particular, the indigenous and farming communities that are found on the frontier of these extractive operations. The negative and destructive impact on their livelihoods and the environment, which of course affects not just the communities, but everyone, but it's the communities that bear the brunt of those heavy social environmental costs. So this is the dominant form that capitalism has taken recently in the region, over the last several decades, in fact. And that's that's in the wake of an enormous growth of foreign investment in natural resources, flows of foreign direct investments, and they're directed not toward industry, but toward extraction of natural resources in the 1990s, within the framework of what's called the New World Order. I don't know if you've heard of this term, New World Order, but you're living in it, whether you know it or not. It's a system that was created in the 1980s, based on the belief, as I said, in the virtues of free market capitalism of the free market, which basically meant the imposition of what's called structural reforms, globalization, which has been to orient the economy not toward the satisfaction of needs and production of goods for the local and national market, but to connect to the global market, the world market, to integrate into the world market, which of course is organized on the basis of capitalist principles. So that's called globalization or economic globalization. And another structural reform dictated by the New World Order, or the Washington Consensus, as we might call it, is privatization, which basically means to privatize national firms, privatize, let's say, the ownership of, in this case, natural resource wealth. Latin America, of course, is one of the wealthiest regions in the world in terms of the wealth of natural resources. So the question is, to whom does this wealth belong, and who has control over it, and who benefits from it? And as I say, the stakes are very high, because not only are the benefits potentially significant, but the costs are extraordinarily high. And of course, the people who pay the costs are not those who reap the benefits. The benefits are predominantly exported or transferred by these corporations that operate in the sector outside the country. The governments take less than 10% of the value of these commodities on the global market in the form of taxes and royalties. Workers, the working class in general, benefit very little because mining and other extractive operations do not require that much labor compared to, let's say, industry, which requires a much larger labor force. So the value of wages that are earned in this sector is certainly less than 10% of the value of the total exported product. So the question is, who gets that 80% of the value of exported profit? Well, I need not repeat myself. It's these corporations. As I said, the costs, however, the environmental costs, damage to the environment, to the health, and to essentially the livelihoods of these local communities, it's just incredibly enormous. It creates conditions that force many of these so-called peasants, agriculture producers, that work to produce for the local markets, What's left of the peasantry after decades of capitalist development, which is a semi-proletariat of rural landless workers. That's what these so-called peasants call themselves now. Most of them are not working on the land. Most of them are forced to migrate. Many of them migrate internationally in the search of alternative employment and a way of life, alternative way of life. Theirs haven't been virtually destroyed but by the extractive operations and other operations of these capitalist enterprises, which of course dedicated to the extraction of profit that can be made from exporting these natural resources. So, well, we see some of the negative effects of this in the massive increase in international migration in the last 2 or 3 decades, which is the result, which has created sort of what we call a rural poverty, immense poverty of rural communities whose way of life and livelihoods have been destroyed. So some of them go into resistance movements, like in the 1990s, many peasants in opposition to the neoliberal reforms, privatization, deregulation of markets, globalization, etc., which has such a negative impact on their livelihoods. Many of them went into the resistance. We had very powerful resistance movements in the 1990s of the Federation of Indigenous Nationalities in Ecuador, CONAIE. You have the landless workers movement in Brazil. You have the peasant movements in Paraguay. All over South America in particular, you have this resistance, which is so powerful that they basically, by the end of the 90s, not only put the neoliberal policy agenda on the defensive, but it basically forced out a number of governments that, that pursued this neoliberal agenda, and they created conditions. They created conditions that by this new millennium, in the early 2000s, led the political left to gain power through electoral means, by the means of democratic electoral politics. So you have like a swing of the pendulum of electoral politics from the right, where it had been for a decade or more, in terms of governments that were wedded to this neoliberal policy agenda. You have a policy shift, what analysts refer to as, how can we say, the pink tide. It's not really radical change, you're not talking of revolution, but we're talking of a shift from the right to the left in a concern to get a more inclusive form of development based on poverty reduction. So, and it's the parties on the left, like the movement towards socialism in Bolivia, Evo Morales, I don't know if you've heard of him, or currently the Workers' Party in Brazil, Lula, who has just recaptured power from the one of the most rightist dictators, destructive environmentalists we've ever seen, even worse than Trump. He's very Trump-like. That's Bolsonaro. I mean, the damage that he's done to the environment in the Amazon and the rural community, just absolutely incredible. So Brazil, very fortunate that the people, after just one term, 4 years, said enough, and they kicked them out, and they turned back to the Workers' Party, back towards the left. Now, Basically what you had is in South America, Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, of course, and Ecuador in particular. Quite a few of the countries in South America, they turned from the right to the left. And there was in pursuit of not a neoliberal policy agenda, but a post-neoliberal agenda of neo-development. That is a concern with creating a more inclusive form of development based on poverty reduction. And in fact, so for a decade, 2002 to 2012, you have this governments pursuing this left-leaning progressive policy agenda, which had a dramatic effect in reducing the rate of poverty for these countries on average 40%. That's after a 50-year war waged by the World Bank since 1973, when the World Bank declared its mandate as being the reduction or alleviation or eradication of poverty. So on the masthead of the World Bank is a statement that our mandate is the war of global poverty. Well, that war has been fought for 50 years by the World Bank with not any sign of reduction of poverty in any of these countries by 2000. Not till this shift to the left and the formation of this progressive cycle do we have any meaningful reduction in the rate of poverty. And that 40% reduction in on average in 6 years is quite significant. In 2012, however, 10 years of this progressive cycle, the governments in this progressive cycle were also turned to extractivism. Now, the collection of taxes and royalties from the exportation of raw materials as a form of fiscal revenues to finance this poverty reduction program. Of course, previous administrations used it to benefit the capitalist class primarily. As I said, there was no reduction of poverty because they pursued policy, the neoliberal policy agenda, which was designed not to reduce poverty, but on the contrary, to increase poverty, increase social inequalities. When you go towards free market capitalism, for the World Bank to talk of poverty reduction, it's ridiculous. I mean, in fact, it's quite stupid to expect that the policies that they were forcing upon the governments, and then to talk of providing through foreign aid, international cooperation, to help to assist these countries reduce the level of poverty. You can't do it because of the contradictions of the system, which basically, or the policies, which to the contrary, as I said, increase the problem of poverty and inequality in the distribution of the social products or income and wealth. So this progressive cycle, or the so-called pink tide of progressive regime change from 2002 to 2012 is sort of like any, I guess, pendulum. It swings back. And in 2012, we began to swing back to the right, primarily as a result of the collapse of the high export markets for these commodities, which basically meant that the governments like Brazil, Ecuador, etc., that relied on the export of these commodities, suddenly had a lot of less income to finance these programs. So it basically created conditions that allow, in some cases, the political right, authoritarian right, the who are pursuing a neoliberal policy agenda to come back to power. Although in most cases, it was not through electoral means, through means of electoral democratic politics, but through a coup staged against the democratically elected leftist regimes by sort of forces on the right, the far right, within Congress, and their support, in some cases, of the armed forces. They basically staged a coup, a short coup in Brazil, although it was called a soft coup because it didn't involve the employment of armed force, but basically it basically employed the tactic of accusing the government, the president, who she was a member of the Workers' Party, of corruption, etc. And then and they tried to impeach her and basically force her out of office, and then replace them with a person more of the liking on the right. And in Bolivia, it was the same thing. It was the right-wing coup. In Colombia, Argentina, and all these cases is that there was at first a turn to the right, reflected in the form of coups, but then also in some cases there was a shift in the tide or in the pendulum of electoral politics, allowing some right-wing politicians like Bolsonaro in Brazil and also in Argentina, etc., to gain power. So there was a swing back to the right, and the resurrection of a neoliberal policy agenda. The only government, I guess, that survived this return back to the right was the government of Venezuela, which is still maintaining this sort of progressive policies in the form of socialism, which took the form of both of nationalizing the resources, basically seen as belonging to the people and not to the companies, and empowering local communities to participate in the development process, giving power to the local communities, which has resulted in a very different kind of socialism that dominated the 20th century. In fact, we refer to it as the socialism of the 21st century, which is then dependent in part, as I said, on communalism, on, let's say, on empowering the local communities to participate in the making of decisions relating to production, exports, and whatever. Like in the case of Bolivia, Evo Morales was the first indigenous person in the world in history, a member of the indigenous communities, to have gained state power, become president of a country. And his party was called Towards Socialism. Así socialismo. And if you ask Evo Morales what's his politics, he would say communalism. That's his understanding of socialism, communalism. Okay, so it's a different form of socialism. So now you have this new dialectic of, because that was always the old battle, right? Capitalism or socialism. And often the solution was to look for a more humane, environmentally green form of capitalism, in order to look for improvements in the social condition of the people within the system. As opposed to in the grassroots sector of society, the search was rather for a form of an alternative, not alternative form of development, capital development. The development basically is equivalent to capitalism. You don't have to say it because everyone assumes that development is based on capitalism. So we use the word development shorthand for capital development. We're not talking social development, we're talking of, or local development, we're talking of capitalist development. So this you have to appreciate the stakes here of moving from, let's say, toward the right or to the left, and now back to the right. It basically means a restoration of neoliberal policies and a deepening of extractivism. In other words, getting rid of all regulations, environmental regulations on extraction of natural resources, protection of indigenous communities, etc. Opening it up, you know, to profit-making corporations. So that, and you have to appreciate that with this kind of, let's say, neoliberal policies, to illustrate, in the case of Mexico, for example, where extractivism has historically, for more than 500 years, taken the form of mining. According to the Attorney General, just a few years ago, up to a few years ago, the share of the Mexican government of the value of the products exported on the global market was less than 2%. And as I say, workers, the extractive operations displaced more work than it created. So workers did not benefit. The government hardly benefit. You have 98% of the value of the exported product is basically extracted, transferred outside. As I said, that's in terms of the benefits. Who gets the benefits? And then, of course, who bears the costs, which are not only great, but they're necessarily borne by the local population, by the indigenous and farming communities on the extractive frontier. That's my general. Where my argument? Let's see if I can. Let's see if I can connect to some illustrations that I have here. I was going to give all kinds of, make all kinds of points that I'll avoid, get over. You don't need to hear this. You don't need to see that. One point is that this extractivist policy is adopted not only by governments on the neoliberal right, on the far right, authoritarian right, but also on the left. And again, because of the coincidence of economic interests, the belief that the governments could benefit from the export of these commodities, not taking into account the indigenous population and their communities and the negative destructive impact on their livelihoods and environment. So as I said, this progressive cycle came to an end in 2012. And the next period, 2012, 2015, a number of these progressive regimes were displaced by neoliberal regimes. So you have, again, you have a switch of the pendulum of politics to the right. I mentioned that this shift to the right, though, in many cases involved not democratic elections, but military or non-military, in most cases, a non-military coup, a coup staged by the right with the support of the US State Department in most cases. Let's give you a couple of examples of this. In 2021, in the last 2 years, we have this a number of progressive regimes were basically booted out of power through not through elections, but through a coup of one form or another. For example, 2021, Pedro Castillo, a member of the left-wing Free Peru Party, was elected president, but he was deposed after less than a year and a half in power through a violent right-wing coup that's engineered by the opposition forces in the Congress. These forces not only forced him out of power by basically arguing that he was proposing to, let's say, abandon the Constitution. So they're going to impeach him. But in the end, because of the balance of forces of the left and the right in the Congress, and sort of like in the US, say, when it moved from, let's say, the Democratic or liberal left to a more right-wing right. So so he's basically going to be impeached for breaching the constitutional order. Not that his breaching of this constitutional order, he was just going to looking for a way around the this right-wing Congress and opposition to policy. So he's basically trying to get around or ignore their policies, which of course they did not like, and they reacted and removed him from power rather than impeaching him. The same thing happened is that at the moment, this right wing in Peru is still in power, but it has generated an enormous, I don't know if it's been in the news at all in the US or Canada, but at the moment the country's been in turmoil when opponents of the coup have took to the streets, and they're still in the streets, and they're basically saying they're going to stay in the streets until Castillo is brought back to power or new elections are held, which his party or the left is very likely to win because of this popular swell of opposition to the coup and support of his policies. So the chances are that they'll have, I'm talking about today, chances are that by next year they'll have elections and that Castillo or some member of his party will be returned to power. Although the problem is the left in Peru is disorganized, very poor leadership, not unified. So that's a bit of, let's say, a problem in checking out or trying to determine what's going to happen over the next year. So as I said, the left likely will have elections, and the left can be expected to win, but it's very difficult to come back to power and to hold power if you have poor leadership. We are unable to take advantage of the popular support. So it's a bit of a mixed bag or uncertain what's going to happen in Peru. Same thing happened in Bolivia. There was a right-wing religious, what shall I call her? A religious cook. He really was. I mean, just totally out of left. Someone like what's her name in the U.S. right now? Congress is full of them. Marjorie Green, etc. Right? Just anyway, they staged a coup. The right wing put her into power, but then in this case, they booted her out of power within a year through democratic elections, and the movement towards socialism, the leftist party, is back in power. So they've been now in power since 2005. So it's a pretty long run in Latin America for a progressive government. Okay, so they had this interruption in the democratic process for 1 year, as they did in Peru, etc. But in any case, what you have here is a trend. The trend is always definitely towards the left, whether it's to the pendulum of democratic politics, or let's say the resistance of indigenous and farming communities on the extractive frontier and their conflict with the multinational corporations. Unfortunately, the governments in many of these cases, even in some progressive cases, were always tended to support the corporations against the local communities because of a coincidence of economic interest. Because they thought, well, you know, we need access to additional fiscal revenues derived from export of these commodities. So that basically, this coincidence of interest basically led them to support the companies against the local population. So that's happening now all over Latin America today, including in Mexico. So you have two levels of what might say is class struggle. At the political level struggle, where it's a struggle between the left and the right, and of the political class, which whether you're on the right or left, seeks to mobilize support from the population. And as I say, it's hard to the outcome is very difficult to predict. And as I said, there's been a tendency of the pendulum of political democratic politics, to switch right to left, but overall the trend is towards the left. But it's the reason why in many cases you can't sustain this movement toward the left is because, as I say, the left, unfortunately, in some cases, are not prepared to meet the challenge. In other words, to poor leadership. Now, in the case of Brazil, people have been following it. I don't know, Bolsonaro. Does this resonate? Yeah, he was sort of a right-wing businessman who took over power some 4 years ago, elected to become to the presidency in Brazil. And as soon as he gained power, basically his program was to outdo Trump. No. And he was a tremendous supporter of Trump, and he was very like Trump. Totally didn't care less about the environment, and was a consummate or passionate liar. And he's done probably more damage to, let's say, the environment in the case of one of the greatest repositories of, let's say, forces against climate change in the world, the Amazon, where he basically immediately came into power. He abolished environmental regulations, just as Trump did in the US, and basically created a free-for-all interest into the Amazon, arguing that these corporations, that the future of Brazil is based on by letting these corporations do their thing. They know what they're doing. Creating enormous sort of course, conflicts, a lot of problems, but now, after 4 years in power, they had another elections, which returned the left, the Workers' Party, back to power in the form of Lula. So now the left has pinned their hopes on another center-left politician who basically invented in Latin America this policy of inclusive development based on transferring income directly to the poor, to poor households. So creating sort of a bonus or the poverty line, according to the World Bank, is something like $30 to $45 a month. And of course, which is extremely low, it's totally ridiculous. But in any case, so his policy was basically to transfer directly to the poor households that level of money transferred directly to households, to the female members of the household wherever possible, on condition that the children be sent to school and go to clinics, etc., etc. So it's called conditional cash transfers. And that's been a very successful policy for reducing poverty in the region. Well, of course, under Bolsonaro, that policy was suspended, but now it's coming back. And also, of course, Bolsonaro has also promised to basically to protect the Amazon in the not only in interest of Brazil, but interest of the world. That will benefit in terms of the let's say the alleviation of climate change based upon pollution of the environment, etc. So it's probably one of the greatest how do you say repositories of CO2, etc. Yeah. So, so we're talking of high-stake politics. So we get involved in this movement toward the left and the right. Let's see if I have some other examples. Part of this second progressive cycle, not the first one, 2002, 2012, but since in the last 3 years, there's been sort of the beginnings of a new progressive cycle. Part of this new progressive cycle are Chile and Colombia. Colombia in particular was always closely friend to the US, you know, the center of its imperialist policies. They depended on Colombia. And likewise with Peru, these governments on the Pacific Rim, from Chile all the way to, well, I guess Mexico, except for Ecuador, which for a while there was one of the most progressive countries in South America, until the vice president under Gutierrez, the president, took over for the government and basically betrayed what's called the citizen revolution, and basically created conditions that have led the right to come back to power. So you had in Ecuador now a shift from the left to the right, but then in Colombia, of all places, as well as Chile, you have a turn back to the left. In the case of Chile, voters a couple of years ago elected Gabriel Boric, which is who is a prominent face of the new Latin American left and a proponent of what he calls radical democracy. Not socialism, but radical democracy. At the age of 34, he is the youngest ever serving president in the world, probably, certainly in the region, could be in the world. And the first millennial to have achieved the highest political office, the presidency. Not only is he a leftist and radical Democrat, he's also an environmentalist and a feminist. 14 of 24 ministries in his government are led by women. And this is a lot of all places. It's quite startling, actually. He resembles very much in terms of his policies Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, I think, in the US context. Which basically means looking at role of the government, compassionate role of the government in order to not only reduce poverty, protect the environment, but to improve the social condition, the welfare of the population in general, not the profits of the dominant corporations. And then, of course, I'll just give you one more example. Mexico. Again, in the second turn to the left, Mexico had always continued to pursue a neoliberal line until the election of Andres Obrador Lopez Obrador AMLO, as people popularly call him. He cobbled together sort of a center-left coalition that gained power some 3 or 4 years ago. And he can be seen as sort of like center-leftist, center-left populist, as opposed to right-wing authoritarian populist, which is Bolsonaro in Brazil. Those are populists of sort. Like you might say, is part of another pink tide, not a red tide, pink tide. It's sort of, mildly socialist, left-leaning policies. Of course, there's a big debate as to whether his policies can be included in what's called neo-extractivism, which is the main policy regime of the progressive cycle, to basically to use the revenues derived from export of natural resources to reduce poverty in the interest of a more inclusive form of development. That's neo-extractivism, which is very different from the old or classical extractivism, which is represented very clearly by mining, the history of mining in Mexico. I could go on, but I'll leave it at that because that's sort of the overall trend. There's a lot of complexities and difficulties in the sort of what you might call a class struggle between the left and the right. And it's a question not only of who occupies the presidency, which is usually through electoral politics, but also who controls the Congress. Again, this one could have the United States in mind here, where the Congress and the president have different minds, go in a different direction. The outcome, that depends on the circumstances, which are highly variable. But as I say, despite the circumstances and conditions that will lead some right-wing politicians to regain power and become the president somewhere or other, the overall trend, in fact, over the last 2 decades, is definitely towards the left, a tilt in national politics towards the left. But whether a progressive policy regime throughout the region can be maintained, that's the question. Just one example from Central America. Again, in many of these governments, you have, like in the United States and Canada, you have the sort of the conservative right and the liberal left, and then you have like in the case of Canada, the New Democratic Party, which is sort of equivalent to the PRD, the Popular Revolutionary Democratic Party in Mexico. sort of oriented towards socialism, a further bit to the left, something that you could never get in the United States. But everywhere else in Latin America, like in Canada, you have a party that represents the socialist option. You know, and they've rarely gained power, but it's there, and they contest for power. And the question is, unfortunately, unlike in Europe, the left and the center, they don't form coalitions. But it's sort of like in the States, they use the first past the post system, which is a very non-democratic system. It basically means that there's a very large swath of the population are totally not represented in the political system. But as I say, so it's difficult to determine the outcome. But as I said, the dominant trend is definitely towards the left, and the chances are that the left will come to this second cycle. Progressive cycle will probably consolidate in the next couple of years. It's only been going on for 2 or 3 years. And then the big open question is, will this progressive cycle lengthen, or will it again be interrupted by one coup or another, which in a Latin American situation is quite possible. In the US, I would never have thought it possible, but Trump proved that it is possible. And he came very close to achieving a coup against a democratic left liberal or center liberal regime. In Latin America, who knows? But it's a fascinating, let's say, scenario. It's definitely worth watching what happens in the next few years in Latin America. Anyway, I'll stop with that. Oh, yeah. Want me to sit down?
Yeah, I want to, now's your chance to ask questions or make comments. If anyone on Zoom wants to do so, I'll give you guys the first shot at it. Okay, I see Mark Ginsburg has a question, followed then by Bob Stone.
Not related to Allen Ginsberg, is it?
Yeah.
Henry, thank you very much for your very comprehensive, both this over a long period and range of countries analysis. The one thing that it didn't get mentioned as much is the kind of international initiatives. I mean, one could talk about the sanctions and all that affect some countries, but I'm more interested in the efforts by Latin American left to create alternative regional association like CELAC and some others. What's your sense of that, and how that fits into the future scenario that is unclear? I agree.
Yeah, I think the political class have not been too successful in cobbling together a broad coalition, both regional or international. I've certainly made the efforts. The one that you mentioned was important, but it really didn't go too far. Much more successful in building international alliances have been the peasant movement, like the land and worker movement in Brazil. They've put together a coalition over of 23, at least 23, let's say, organizations and countries all over the world that define themselves as peasants. And by peasant, they really mean, small agricultural producers that produce for the local market as opposed to for the capitalist market. So it's basically agricultural producers who are opposed to capitalism in the agricultural sector and look for the development of alternatives. And these peasants have been very successful in not only cobbling together a global international coalition, but in actually outlining and elaborating an alternative model of development. So resistance not simply takes the form of conflict and opposition and taking to the streets, etc., but actually in the construction of viable alternatives to capitalism in the agricultural sector. So if the political class in in Latin America was able to follow the lead of this peasant movement, I think the fortunes of the left would be much greater. At the moment, I would say that there's very little influence whatsoever, international influence on developments in Latin America. It really is local. The only exception is Cuba, which of course has been surrounded by forces from the outside that has had to contend with for 50 years or whatever. So there you have evidence of a very strong impact, international impact that is, I guess, limited and shaped the form that development's taken in a country. I can't think of anywhere else where the left has built a solid international alliance.
Okay, Bob Stone. You are muted. You are muted.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Henry. Excellent review of the situation and very, very helpful, I would say. I wanted to ask you what you thought about the recent visits of Yanis Varoufakis to Cuba and Mexico. Is there something wrong with the sound?
You have to mute the machine clip. We won't have the speaker.
We presume it's a sound system and not you.
Okay, I'll continue. Varoufakis addressed the Cuban Congress and proposed two movements. One for the a new non-aligned movement in the world, and secondly, a new economic order. Everything okay, Roberto? As you remember, Yanis Varoufakis is the leader of DM, which is the Democracy in Europe movement. And he's also a founder of the Progressive International, which is one of the movements calling for reconceiving the struggle for socialism on a global scale. It's a new international that he wants to promote. On the 27th, in his talk at the Congress of Cuba, he advanced the notion of transferring wealth from capitalist corporations to their workers, the ownership of those corporations. And he said it was as utopian as abolition of the divine right of kings was in the 15th century. So it's a vision which he wants to promote. But he thinks it's necessary now to save humanity from itself. The parasitical growth of fossil fuel based economies is killing the planet. And there's the risk, he also points out, of nuclear war with this war in Ukraine. So I wanted to ask you, Henry, what you think of this. He left Cuba on the 30th and came to Mexico, where he visited with AMLO, who told him to keep up the struggle. And they had a meeting, sympathetic meeting on the topic. Surely this is a new dimension in the left, the global left, to call for worker ownership and control of the means of production at the point of production. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on Giannis, his program, his vision for a new non-aligned world and a new economic system based on worker control.
To be honest, I know very little about the project and the movement, but I would say that the project is not that you described is not that new. That's the main project of, I think, the left throughout the 20th century, which is basically, to basically not only give more control of workplaces to workers, but an increased share of the social product, etc. That's been the dominant struggle, I think, throughout the 20th century. I think in the 21st century, the struggle is going to be not so much over land and labor, which is the two big major struggles in the 20th century, but it's going to be over water, and it's going to be over access of natural resources and access to what's called the global commons, which is basically territories that people can use for their subsistence and development. And I think what the political left, both in Europe and Latin America, that should come together, that they could draw a lot of lessons from looking at the struggles of these indigenous communities in Latin America. I think that's where, I think, in terms of, especially in terms of the role of the environment in it, because until recently, I myself was included in that in the left, the environment was sort of ignored or downplayed, but it is, I think, definitely the key element of the struggle that's unfolding now in the 21st century. As to what form it might take, what projects, what visions, etc. I myself am very impressed by the vision associated with this indigenous cosmology in Latin America, in Ecuador and Peru, where they talk about not creating development, but what they call buen vivir, conditions under which people can live in social solidarity and harmony with nature. How to get there, what program, and the process involved in pushing that program forward, again, is, I think we're just at the beginning of it. The beginnings of it, of a movement that might be associated with what's called this concept of socialism of the 21st century. And in which, again, the environment is going to play a much stronger role than socialism in the past. And the indigenous communities, I think, will provide, to be honest, the leadership to the left. Because they've been much more successful in developing this vision and how to implement it, that, to be honest, than the political left, either in Europe or in Latin America. So I'll say, look to the indigenous peasant communities at their struggle and learn what they can from that. The left can learn a lot. from those struggles.
Are there any questions or comments from the audience here?
Yeah.
Yeah, come forward.
Okay, thank you for your talk. You said that the term development is synonymous with capitalism. With the pink tide of more Latin American countries adopting more left-leaning, presumably less capitalistic governments, does that mean that there will thereby be less development? Or will it be different development rather than less? Other than what you mentioned about using tax and other funds from extractive corporations for social programs. Of course, one expects more social spending, healthcare, education, infrastructure, but what about manufacturing industry? And the other point I wanted to make quickly was you mentioned the conditional cash transfers in Brazil, which sounds like a very interesting thing. Different countries have mentioned this. And so I'm just wondering if other Latin American countries have adopted that. And I know there was talk about some European countries, maybe Sweden was thinking about adopting it. So if you have anything that you can add about that, that would be nice.
Okay, I'll take the second question
Sure, thank you.
first. Yes, at least 19 countries in Latin America have adopted this policy of conditional cash transfers. Even Mexico, in the 90s, when it was following a neoliberal line, moved towards what was then called the new social policy, which is basically based on what's called the post-Washington consensus on the need for a more inclusive form of development and to bring the government, the state, back in. Particularly in terms of creating conditions for inclusive development, which means education, health, educational opportunities, health, as well as a more equitable distribution of income and a greater share of the social product. So this is referred to by the originators of this policy as neo-developmentalism. So the origin again goes to Brazil by economists associated with the UN Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. In English, what's it, the ECLEC, or CEPAL in Spanish. So that's the program. That's inclusive development. So it'll take a new form. And again, particularly in terms of a new social policy. The problem is with this new developmentalism is that it was predicated on foreign investment in natural resources and making a deal with these corporations when a lot of the governments are not in a good position to make a deal. And the deal that many of these governments, even the left, have struck with the companies have been very good for the companies, very bad. So in other words, this new developmentalism has its limits. It's more progressive. It's created much better social conditions for a larger part of the population. Reducing the poverty by 50% is not insignificant. That's you don't have to be a radical Democrat or a Marxist to see the importance of that. It's not a revolution, but it's very, to the people who are living this, this income support directed to them. That's major. It's a major improvement in the lives of the population. But the end of the let's say the primary commodities boom in the capitalist market showed the limitations of this approach, because it's still based upon a reliance on foreign investment in natural resources, in extraction of natural resources, and under conditions controlled by the corporations, and in which the governments have not been able to strike a good deal. So the new progressive policy on the left, they have to find a way out, an alternative to a reliance on foreign investment, to mobilize domestic sources of capital, and to use that not only to develop the natural resources for export in primary commodity form, but to industrialize those resources. Need a combination of extractivism, natural resource extraction, not extractivism. But extractivism basically means natural resource extraction under monopoly control of the capitalist system. You don't want extractivism, but natural resource extraction is going to be part of the future. It has to be, but so does industry. That's key. So right now, the biggest problem on the left, the biggest debate is what role does natural resource extraction play in the new economy and what's called the post-extractive transition towards a green economy, etc. That's the question. And the agreement is that natural resource extraction can become a positive factor, is important to include, but you have to change the conditions under which these resources are extracted and who controls them. And this is where government comes in. You need more government regulation, environmental regulations, regulation of investments, especially of these corporations. They have to again find alternative sources of capital locally. These countries have a lot of natural resource wealth, but they also have the capacity to generate capital for their own development. See, the problem right now is that much of this capital is drained out of the country, out of the region, so that other countries, Canada, the US, benefit from it at the expense of the local population. So they can generate alternatives to foreign investment, but at the moment there's no, let's say, no strong movement towards that. Another major factor is what is called human development, which means development in the form of not of natural resources, but human resources, which involves education and health, knowledge, etc. If you look at different forms of capital, natural capital, like the wealth of natural resources, manufactured capital, which is basically industry, and then financial capital, which refers to the financial resources used to create wealth. The most important form of capital is human capital. Because if you look at the UN has done a study of 5 years ago on this, what they call the wealth of inclusive wealth of nations, which basically showed that the countries with the highest percentage of its wealth in the form of natural resources, like we have Bolivia, Congo, Zaire, etc., are often the poorest countries, and where the countries with the lowest, let's say, share of natural capital, like Japan, they have to import a lot of their natural resource, but natural resource poor are among the most developed countries in the world because they've invested in people, in health and education, etc. This is the most critical factor. Imagine a country like Guyana in South America, 80% of people educated to the university level, with the highest level of education in the country, are living outside the country in Canada and the US, which basically means that those countries get the benefit of human resources without having to pay for it. Because Guyana spends a lot of money in health and education to bring, how do we say, these human resources to market. And then through the mechanism of international migration, countries like the US and Canada gets these human resources literally for free And that is the critical factor of development. Kind of, if you want development, it's the accumulation of human capital. So of course, what these countries should do is insist that the US and Canada pays this country back for what they've invested in the human resource that they've acquired on the market for free. I'm just bringing this to point out here that this is another dimension of development, not just natural resource extraction, but human development. That is the most critical. I'm talking now as a specialist in international development, what we call critical development studies. That's the program that I'm in Zacatecas, in Mexico. That is the most critical factor of development, accumulation of human resources for development, human development rather than natural resources. Yeah, there's no way that countries like in Latin America can develop fully without taking advantage of its natural resource wealth. But the conditions under which that natural resource wealth is used for development, that has to change radically. And of course, you can't leave it in the hands of the corporations. You've got to put it back in the hands not only of the governments, but of the local communities, who should have an increased role in the conservation of those natural resources and having a say in who benefits from it. I forget what I was trying to say.
Thank you. All very interesting. What I want to ask you about is why is there such a great opposition in North America to coalitions? So now in Canada, we in effect have one, but we don't call it that because our sort of socialist NDP has agreed to support the Liberals for the next few years. Why such an opposition coalition?
US. Well, you can also ask why such an opposition to socialism. Like socialism, it's not possible to be socialist in the US. Well, yeah, but they would still define that, or people right, they would still define that as socialism, or even say communism, etc. In Canada, socialism is not a bad word, and it's mainly because it's associated with social democracy and a political party which has advocated it and created some of the most important developments in the country, especially in terms of health and education. That's been very much dependent on the significant role played by the NDP, the Social Democratic Party. But in the United States, as I say, in a winner-take-all approach to politics, it's not possible to move beyond the two-party system. Conservative Republicans and the Liberal Democrat, basically. And the lack of coalition building, it's a question of same thing in Canada. There was a movement not that long ago, and Trudeau at first actually supported it, towards what's called proportional representation, which basically means that rather than awarding seats to the party that has won the most seats, and if you have, let's say, division of 3 or 4 parties competing for seats, you can actually win the seat with about 20–30% of the vote. Like in the US, no one ever gets 50% of the vote. It's always a lot less. But so that basically means that a lot of people are not represented in the two-party system, and the way out is what have in Europe, proportional representation. And when you have proportional representation, you'll have the capacity to build coalitions. Within a two-party system, you can't really build coalitions. And most people here, Canadian or American? So I can talk as much as I can badly about the government. Yeah. I just want to mention to you. What?
Well, I was wondering if you wanted to say,
No.
you're done? Okay. So my name is Brian McDougall. I am a Canadian, which means I will, at the end, make a comment about the NDP. But I found your presentation really interesting and concerning because through much of the discussion, you contrasted the left and the right. And I found myself uncomfortable with the characterization of so many movements as being part of the left. You occasionally alluded to the differences between the pink tide and a possible red tide,
The center left.
acknowledging that there is something to the left of what you were normally calling the left.
Yeah.
I think that in many ways, the experience in Latin America demonstrates something that those of us who are Marxists should have understood a long time ago. We saw the experience of social democracy after World War II. And social democracy did, in fact, win some reforms that improved the quality of people's lives. That's indisputable. It did not end capitalism. It was never intended to end capitalism. Social democracy, as it emerged from the period of World War I, as an anti-revolutionary project of negotiating better terms within capitalism and demobilizing working classes movements and controlling them to make sure that they didn't overturn the system. That kind of so-called socialism is, I think,
Or the pink tide.
I think that what we see in Latin America with the pink tide is another variation of that kind of social democratic politics within capitalism. It didn't work in Europe. It hasn't worked in Latin America. It is not the solution to the problems that we face in the 21st century, particularly when we have to acknowledge that the reality of climate crisis means that there is no single national solution to the problem of global capitalism. So we should not be talking about the strengths and weaknesses of another wave of social democracy. What we really need to be talking about is the need for a global revolution that can handle the climate crisis issue, as well as all of the other issues that we've been struggling against for a long period of time. And just if I can sort of indulge my audience for a second here, on the NDP, in the context of Canada, the NDP has been a classic social democratic party. From the 1930s, when it was formed, it has evolved consistently over to becoming another neoliberal party struggling for the center of the political spectrum, which is the reason why it's in a coalition with the Liberal Party in Canada at the moment. Over and over again, social democracy in Canada in the last couple of decades since the rise of neoliberalism has proven its neoliberal credentials. It is not part of the solution. It is part of the problem. We need to move beyond all the various forms of social democracy and go back to the notions of revolution that were being championed at the time of World War I. And, you know, that doesn't mean that we give up the struggle for reforms. Rosa Luxemburg was really clear about this and really good about it. She understood that the difference between social democrats and revolutionaries was not that one struggled for reforms and the other didn't, but rather that revolutionaries struggled for reforms in ways that prefigured and built the possibility to go beyond those reforms to actually overthrowing the system itself. Thanks.
Well, I don't agree in principle with, I don't disagree with anything you really said. The only question is, where does it get us? If we're somewhere between dystopia, which is what reality many of us face, and utopia, where you're turning a little bit towards that, in my view, just in terms of what's possible and what's not possible, what's likely, what's unlikely. In terms of Latin America, I think you can't just put the option. I think you have a center-left dialectic without question, but you also have a lot of variations of the center and the left, and you also have a movement beyond the center-left distinction. In other words, people who look for not another form of development, making capitalism more, green or solitary, palatable, etc., but looking not for another form of quote development, but an alternative to development. And that's where a lot of this indigenous cosmology and conception of post-development come in, where in a way you're moving beyond the left and right in that context, because you're moving outside the so-called development conundrum, which is basically confined to the capitalist system. Huh?
No moving outside of climate catastrophe conundrum, to either deal with it locally or
Yes,
not.
yes, but the argument making here is you can't solve that problem as well as problems like poverty, etc., within the capitalist system. In other words, you can't just simply look for institutional policy change, different policies, institutional change, but you need a change of the system. That's, I think, that's what we're getting at. So when we're looking at post-neoliberalism, post-development, you can't just look at it, what's happening in Latin America, as another reform move. As I said, what we're looking at here is the beginnings of the germs of a movement beyond reform, so to say, beyond capitalism, beyond neoliberalism, beyond development. We call this post-development. Now, as to whether it requires a revolutionary transformation of the political system and how to achieve that, well, of course, the issue is what are the social forces in the society that can be used to mobilize support for such a radical program, a program that says, okay, we want more than reform, we want another system. Fine. And Latin America, the forces in favor of that is much stronger than anywhere else, than in Canada, the US, Europe, nothing there. But in Latin America, at least you have the problem posed, how to move beyond capitalism. That's really the central issue.
Well, I have one point I'd like to raise regarding Mexico. One of the things that AMLO is attempting to do is to reverse the privatization of the energy sector that was undertaken by his predecessor, Peña Nieto. The problem, of course, is that that privatization was locked into the treaty arrangements under NAFTA 2.0, and so there is a legal basis for the United States and the petroleum and other energy companies to challenge his efforts. AMLO is caught in a contradiction because on the one hand, he wants to reestablish Mexican sovereignty over those energy sources, but at the same time, that means promoting the fossil fuel sector, which is injurious to the climate mitigation policies the country is committed to.
Well, I think AMLO is a person full of contradictions. in terms of left, right, he's center, he's on left leaning, but at the center, not the left really, but left leaning, like a lot of social democrats in Canada are, like they're not leftists, but they're left leaning, like they're tending towards the left. As I call them center people, it's the center left, which is the dominant space occupied by people who want change, but don't want to abandon capitalism. You know, sort of what you refer to as reformism. Well, he is a reformist and a populist, but he has not resolved the contradiction between his policies and what he calls the fourth revolution and environmental degradation of these mining companies and other companies in the sector, which he has not abandoned. He still relies, like some of the other so-called progressive governments in South America, on the multinational corporations for capital to extract the resources and put it in the world market. And has not found a way or a formula to how, shall we say, to hold up, to basically to control or regulate these corporations, who are basically holding the country and him hostage. They have more power than he does in terms of deciding this fundamental policy, because basically means, is he prepared to abandon capitalism, reliance on foreign investment for development? He might be well-meaning, but he's not willing to abandon the system. And he's not found a solution within the system. And that's not to say that a solution is not possible, but it hasn't found it. And in Mexico, like other countries in Latin America, some of the countries, it's very difficult to identify any force for social transformation or radical change. Like, what would be the social base of that movement? People on the left, they want it, move towards it, but they didn't know how. And then again, as I said, there's no easily identifiable social force that would allow the country to move beyond capitalism and its environmental destruction, beyond capitalism, neoliberalism, and extractivism. But in Latin America, at least, there is, in fact, a strong movement building on the grassroots, not at the level of government or the political class, because the political class in Mexico, as elsewhere, is caught within its own contradictions and limitations, and is not likely to escape them. That's why the solution is much more likely to be found in the grassroots organization of social movements on the frontier of extractive capitalism, the indigenous communities, which until recently people would always ignore as an insignificant factor in economic, social, political development. But the indigenous population and communities are proven to be much more resilient and capable of imagining, conceiving of alternatives and moving the country perhaps towards that. So I'm not going to say that here you have a new revolutionary class to replace the working class, you know, because any kind of radical change will require coalitions to be built, but in this case between workers and the residents and the indigenous communities. If you can build a coalition between these three forces, I think you have a good possibility of moving towards or beyond capitalism.
Well, I wanted to thank Henry for his presentation today. And I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. This presentation, as well as all of our previous ones are available on our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Next Monday, again at 1 o'clock, our speaker will be Pedro Gerhardt, who's head of the Mexico-Palestine Friendship Association, and he will be accompanied by a representative from the Palestinian Embassy in Mexico City. On Thursday this week at 11:30, we will be pleased to have a film on Abba House. Where Can We Be Safe? Film is made by Judy Jackson, who will be with us to discuss her film. And we expect that we'll have a sold out house. So I would suggest that you make your reservation online at our website, globaljusticecenter.org, where we will also be happy to have you make your donations to support our work and to be able to continue to pay our local staff. I want to close by thanking our webinar team, Liz Mestres, Roberto Robles, Bob Stone, Betsy Bowman, Olivia Canales, and myself. And now this is Cliff Duran signing off for now.